because that's something in architecture we're always on the end of as a student.
Sure.
And the field itself is always kind of criticizing each other. You know, it's a highly contentious field.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of why I reached out to you. I think you also look at buildings as well, right?
Yeah, so I do look at building. Obviously, the lines between architecture and art are not clear cut, nor are they between art and design or fashion or many other fields. So yeah, it makes sense to consider it all. And then if we think about it, right, to box off art is like the least art thing you can do, right? Because the reason art exists is that it's unlike architecture, which obviously there is an artistic element, but there's also a functional element.
Yeah.
Art does not have a function. So for someone to turn around and go, well, that's not art, is almost like, well, the whole point of art is everything can be art. So you can't close it off, which is very odd because a lot of people do try and close it off.
It's interesting you just said art doesn't have a function.
Yeah, well, as in when I say a function, I mean a sort of utilitarian function rather than a spiritual or emotional function.
I see.
Yeah.
So these are the kind of the deep topics I wanted to get into.
Good, straight in there.
We could get straight into it, but you know what? I'm going to save it because we're going to really get into this in a second.
Okay.
How does one become an art critic? Because I guess in some ways we're all critics of art.
Yes.
We all have our own subjective views of things, but to be known as an art critic and to have a kind of professional kind of background in that, how do you become an art critic?
It's I'll get into my story because it's quite meandering, but it's that thing that I still consider myself like an imposter or an outsider art critic. Because if you think about what an art critic traditionally is, it's someone who's got a degree in either art history or journalism.
I see.
So you're coming from one of those angles. That's normally, and I've got neither of those backgrounds. So I still see myself as somewhat of an imposter. So let's talk about how I became an art critic, because then you'll understand where it's coming from. So I graduated as a biomedical scientist. So I cut up dead bodies. I specialized in anatomy. That was my thing. And weirdly enough, even from before that, I was one of these people. I mean, it's going to make me sound like a typical second generation Indian, because my parents were born in India, came over here. Very much like hard sciences was where my interest was. You know, art was for people who didn't want to work hard. You know, that's how I had this view in my head, which is so blinkered. But obviously at the time, I didn't think that. And then I thought, right, what do I do after biomedical science? So I stumbled around looking for graduate jobs, ended up in a job in the energy sector, which is still my day job. I still have a full-time day job in the energy sector. I've been doing that for 12 years. And then in my first energy job, I was commuting on the Victoria line to work. And if you commute, you obviously see a lot of advertisements, right? You see them on the tubes, up on the top of the carriages. And I would see them and there'd be things like Tate Modern, Saatchi Gallery, Royal Academy. And I thought, I don't know anything about art. My parents have no interest in art. None of my extended family really have much of an interest in art. None of my friends have an interest in art. I was like, why not try something out, something different to do outside of work? Because everyone needs something to do, right? So I went to a few galleries. For the life of me, can't remember what the first one was. But I really started to enjoy it, started to go to more, started finding out about more, because once you start seeing some, you start looking for things, you start looking at things like Time Out or Shortlist or whatever's going on, magazines. So I started going more and more. And then a cousin of mine, she went, well, why don't you just write about them, because you're seeing so much and you could start your own blog. And back in, this would have been about 2010, maybe 2009, like blogs were still relatively new, right? So I started my own blog, which I believe still exists, though I haven't written anything on it for many years.
What was it called?
It was called londonartscene.blogspot.com. So it's a blogger one. And I'm sure if you Google it, it's still there, right? So I started writing, just practicing. And then I started thinking, well, where can I share my writing? Who would happily publish it? And back then there was a website called Londonist, which is who I write for today. And they were very small, volunteer-led. I think no writers got paid at the time. And I just saw that they wrote a lot about London, but they didn't write about London's art scene. So I thought,
So they were just writing about just normal touristy stuff.
Well, no. So Londonist started off as kind of like London history, but in a very accessible, light-hearted way. So it's kind of like the stuff about London that you may not know, even though you work here all the time. You know, the little things you might not notice.
Like gems and...
Yeah, little gems, little hidden gems, little hidden facts, little bits of history. You know, if you walk around, you'll find bits of like damage from World War II, but you wouldn't have noticed that you walk past it every day. Things about the London Underground and its bizarre history, you know, why the hell does the Metropolitan line go so far out? And, you know, all those sorts of things. And once you discover the history, you understand it. So that's how Londonist started out. And then I said, well, you know, you don't have anyone writing about art. Do you want one? And I went, well, you know, we don't pay anyone, so we'll happily give you a chance, right, and see what happens. The irony being the professional outfit that Londonist is today, who does pay all its writers, like, they would never have taken a chance on someone so amateur as I was back then. But obviously, timings aligned.
What year was this?
So this would have been about 2011/12.
Wow, okay.
Right?
Quite recent.
Yeah, so it's not that long ago, yeah. So I started writing and I thought, this is great. I started writing more and more. And because of that, obviously through Londonist, I started to hear about more exhibitions. Then I got rolling momentum and I thought, I'll keep writing about things. And then 9 years later that we are now, that, you know, when I look up at those same tube posters on train stations, occasionally they'll have like a 4 or 5 star Londonist, which is mine. So it's really nice to see my story come full circle, which is why you'll probably catch me taking a photo of my own posters on the tube.
That's amazing. I didn't expect it to be such a sort of late venture.
Yeah, very late.
Because I guess one of my maybe silly questions was, there's no course for becoming an art critic, because you quite rightly said you either come from a background of art history or journalism.
Yes.
And that's the sort of background you would need to get into the profession of what is it called? Art critic as a profession?
I think there are now courses for art criticism. Yeah, but art history is by far traditionally the route to get into being an art critic. Yeah. So that's where most of them you'll come across. But I think that's the joke where I talk about I'm an outsider and an imposter, like, you know, I haven't come down a normal route, but that's what makes me who I am, right? So there's a joke within Londonist too, and I've kind of adopted this title that they used to jokingly call me the people's art critic. So I'm like, I'll take that and own it myself. And it's that idea that I don't come with the art history lens. So when I'm writing for a Londonist audience who are not art specialists, right? They read Londonist for like food, travel, history, news, right? So for them, my writing's more accessible than someone who's not necessarily, but tends to be more accessible than someone steeped in art history. Right. Because as you would probably know, right, if you read there's a difference between writing about architecture for a newspaper versus writing an architecture journal, right? Sure. It's a different type of text. So
would you say you're more on that newspaper stuff?
Yeah, more on that newspaper, more in a very like colloquial, jokey, relaxed kind of style of writing.
Those are the ones that are more kind of accessible to the lay people.
Exactly, and that's what I want to be.
Yeah, and I think that's where, you know, not that you're doing it solely for success, but I think that's where the success is, you know, monetary and, you know, even, you know, in terms of reaching the masses, there's a huge value to be able to communicate, you know, what is a very, you know, a specialist field, conveying these kind of complex ideas in a very simple and understandable way. Yeah. And you're definitely right. You see that in architecture. And I think one of the contentions in architecture is, you know, are we able to actually, you know, confidently say that the public does really know what we do as a profession?
Yeah.
So I can definitely see how you kind of were successful with that. And, you know, the numbers kind of speak for themselves if you just look at the sheer sort of following that the Londonist has, and even yourself as a, you know, your own Instagram page. You know, how did you kind of rise to Instagram fame in a way?
I don't know. I think, you know what helped me, weirdly enough, is the fact that, and I don't mean this because obviously art critics are a wide and diverse field, but it naturally lends itself to academics. And because there's so few art critics, they tend to be towards the older demographic than I am. Because obviously, once you've got one there, you can't replace them until they move on, right? And most of them want to do it for the rest of their life, because why wouldn't you, right? Once you're in that position, if you're the art critic for the Times, why would you want to move on, right? It's great. So, but that means you've got a lot of art critics who aren't very social media savvy, because like they're the same age as my parents, right? My parents don't know what they're doing on social media. They shouldn't be on social media, right? So with all the best will in the world and love to my parents, they are awful at that sort of stuff, right? So it's that thing that I just happened to be the right age group for people coming through Instagram and wanted to make it accessible. And you know what? It's a great medium for making art accessible, right? So I could just post something and somebody would be like, I didn't know that was round the corner from me. I'll go check it out, right? So
It's the perfect platform.
I think it is. I mean, this will probably date on your podcast very fast, but it's closing because it's closing tomorrow. But round the corner from here, the consultancy firm Arup, who are a very global, massive consultancy firm, in their reception, they have got, and you wouldn't even notice it. You walk past reception, it looks normal. There's this like black curtains with some text next to it. And you go through the black curtains, you go through 3 sets of black curtains, and it gets colder and colder as you go in. And inside it, they've got a slice of an Antarctic ice core.
Oh, wow. I saw that on your Instagram.
Yeah, and I thought, no one's going to stumble across
Is that actual ice?
Yeah, it's actual ice from the Antarctic, thousands of years old, potentially. And you're like, it's being stored at -6. And you think, and obviously the artist is about drawing attention to climate change and the fact that the ice core actually holds in its pockets air that could be thousands of years old, right? So he's drawing attention to those sorts of things. But it's also the idea that something like that can exist and you can walk past it and you wouldn't even know it's there, right? And that's the benefits of Instagram. Obviously, there are some downsides, but that's what it can give you.
100%. Yeah, I think there's a huge value in that. I'd love to go and see that.
Yeah, we got to go tomorrow is the last day. Right?
Gotta go tomorrow, I reckon. But especially because Arup is so, such a prolific kind of player in architecture as well.
Of course, yeah, massive. More so than art. I was surprised they had an art installation. I was like, oh, let me go check this out.
Yeah, I mean, for a company that size to do something, what would seem quite an intimate thing in their office. But, I kind of want to talk about, go back to that train journey you talked about.
Yeah, of course.
Where you're coming to this kind of realization of, because I'm someone who from a very young age was extremely passionate about art.
Right.
One of my first memories, I guess, kind of more significant memories to do with art. Obviously, I was drawing a lot as a kid, and my eldest brother taught me how to draw a face, and taught me about what features you need, and I was kind of hooked by that, and I would sit in my room and draw hundreds and hundreds of pages of faces. But it was actually when 9/11 happened.
Okay.
And it was actually my mom who keeps telling me this story,
Right.
just to remind me, because she was so, I guess, amazed or kind of taken back by what I did. And I'd basically gone into my room either out of, being scarred from what I'm seeing on TV,
Right.
or almost a kind of obliviousness to the seriousness of what's going on. Because at that age, you're just like, what is going on? I had drawn a picture of the burning towers, and I think what really hit me was the people who were jumping off.
Of course, yeah.
And so I think, much to her surprise and maybe shock, she came and saw me drawing a picture of that.
Right.
And I don't know, she was just very kind of shocked at that. And I think at the time she thought that I'd kind of been traumatized by that.
Okay.
But what I guess I'm trying to get at is, were you as a child passionate about art? Because to go into biomedicine and then later have that.
So I had like nothing. I mean, I remember at primary school, I did like to draw. And I think I remember when I got to high school, I realized I was rubbish at painting. And I thought, well, so when it came to GCSE choices, art wasn't even in contention. So I didn't even consider it. But then there's a wonderful article about drawing. I think it's in The Guardian, I think by one of their art critics, Laura Cooming, who writes about the fact that the act of drawing of all the art forms is the most kind of innate. Even people who sit there in meetings on teleconferences are like doodling in the margins of their notepad. People who sit on buses when the windows have steamed up are just kind of making random abstract patterns with their fingers. It's like everyone does it. There is no person out there who has never drawn. You know, it's as natural as walking, right? So I suppose in that sense, there is that. I was trying to think what it is that drew me to art. It might have been the open nature of it. You know, the whole idea of like, as a child, I always wanted to understand how things work. And that's maybe what took me to biomedicine, you know, how the human body works. But art's the same, right? When you go into something at first, especially contemporary art or even old masters, right? Sometimes you don't know what's going on. So you have to kind of think about it and go like, well, what is happening? What is behind this work? What is the story and the narrative? And yeah, maybe that's what it is.
As an artist, are you saying that?
As the viewer of the art.
Wow.
Because a lot of contemporary art, a lot of it's conceptual, right? Yeah. You go in there, at first you're like, I don't know what this is, right? And you have to think about it.
So sometimes you take kind of joy in working it out in a way.
Yeah. Probably more of like a science engineering side, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of being a critic, that would be a very critical skill as well, right?
Yeah, I'd hope so. Yeah,
because you want to kind of unpack the layers of what's going on as well as an art critic, because there's obviously the layperson's first instinct to a piece of art. They may look at a piece of art and be like, oh, it's just splodges. But if you're an art critic and you know the deeper levels of what's going on, you'd be like, no, that's a Pollock.
Yes. So sometimes it is. Sometimes it just is smudges, right?
Well, we'll actually get onto.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing about around art, but then also might be digressing a little bit. But one of the things I want to do as a writer is get people. I want to get people who are the old me, as in the person who didn't think art served any value and wasn't very interested in it, to become into art. And obviously it happened to me. Now, I'm not expecting them to become like full-fledged art critics, right? But what I want is the fact that people can go from not knowing anything about art, not thinking it's for them, to being something they get some enjoyment out of or some impact out of. I mean, it's this ridiculous concept when you say to people, you know, someone says to me, oh, you know, I'm not really interested in art. Art's not my thing, or I don't get art. And it's somehow accepted in society. But if someone turned around to you and went, I just don't see what the point of TV is. You know, I'm not really interested in it. And you're like, really? Like all those genres, like all those programs, there's nothing, literally nothing.
Yeah, or nowadays, I don't have Netflix. And you're like, what? You don't have Netflix? So many series?
Yeah, there must be something you like there, right? With art, we kind of accept that it is very niche, but it isn't. It's so broad, right? It's as broad as music or as film, you know? And yet, film and music and TV, they all appeal to everyone, well, almost everyone. So why shouldn't art?
Yeah, that's very true. That's very interesting, actually, because with music, it is an art in some ways, actually. Yeah. But in terms of when you have a sensory response to a beautiful harmony, it almost instantly enters your brain, even if you didn't want it to.
Yeah.
There's almost a level of actually, because you can't close your ears, you're then forced to, listen to the world. Yeah. But because you can close your eyes, you could actually, not.
Assuming the art was just purely visual, right?
There you go. Okay. So that's question number 10, I think.
Okay.
When you look at a piece of art or architecture, for matter of fact, what are you actually looking at? And I suppose in some ways you're looking to have a kind of instinctive reaction to the work, naturally, like most of us.
Yeah.
But as a professional critic, by the way, is that the right thing to say?
Probably that's fine, yeah.
Because the missus tells me to not be what's the word? Criticizing. So
yeah,
I don't want to offend you.
I suppose if I get paid for it, technically that's a professional critic. So yeah, that's what I am, right?
Maybe I'm in the wrong profession. But as a professional critic, are there any other layers that obviously you're kind of trying to tap into when you see a piece of art or architecture?
I think there is that kind of instinctual gut response, right? And everyone has that. I'm helped by the fact that the more you see, the more you become attuned to it. Now, I don't think it's something that you need a formal education to do. Obviously, I have no formal education in being an art critic. But the more you see, the more you do become attuned to what artists are doing, and the more you can draw comparisons from what else you've seen. I always joke that I'm still trying to feel like I'm trying to play catch up because I spent so many years not embracing art. There are people who are like 22 in the art world who've seen more art than I have because, they were seeing it as a child. Their parents took them to galleries from a young age. So I did. I made the sweeping comment that I visit a roughly 1,000 shows a year, exhibitions a year. And so last year I thought, you know what, I'm going to do a tally and see what I get to. And I was right. So last year I made 1,169. There you
Wow.
go. I'm not doing it again this year. That's too much effort.
And how much did that cost?
Well, a lot of it. Well, I'm an art critic, so I don't pay for anything. So transport costs, I suppose. Yeah, but we should talk about the cost, because as well as people saying, "Oh, art's not for me," it's worth noting that yes, if you go to the big museums for their exhibitions, they can be north of £20, right? They're quite expensive these days. But there's so much art that's free, right? Like the Arab one I talked about. Any commercial gallery, so as in this is a gallery that sells work rather than a museum, they're all free to enter because ultimately they are shops. Yes, they're intimidating, but that's because they're essentially luxury shops, right? It's the same intimidation you'd get if you walked into a Lamborghini showroom. You don't have to pay to go into a Lamborghini showroom, but you do feel a bit intimidated. Or a Versace shop, right? Those are the sorts of things. That's what an art gallery essentially is, right? So most art galleries are free, and even the big museums have free sections, even if the exhibitions themselves are paid, most of them. So yeah, it's free. So there's the only cost is transport, really. And if you're in town anyway, then there's not that cost anyway. So I love the fact that it is so accessible and yet so inaccessible. So that's kind of what I'm trying to bridge the gap to say it doesn't have to cost you. You could, I could say thing like opera, right? You do have to pay generally to go see opera. So you could say there's that barrier, same with ballet or dance but even TV, TV's not free, right? You got to pay for TV. People do happily. So yeah.
Yeah. And then, so when you're actually looking at this sort of piece of art, and because the thing that made me think about this is there's so many similarities when I think of, because I don't know if you know, but there's one of the most common words in architecture studies is the crit.
Right, yes.
So the crit being, I've got a crit coming up on Monday, actually, funnily enough.
I'm guessing similar to art where people try and take yours, try and criticize your work to see how they can pick it apart and what can be improved, right?
Yeah. So, I think it's often a very difficult process to sit there and take the criticism. But, as you know, in the creative process and the design process, you need that kind of scrutiny from many different perspectives.
Sure.
The similarities I've seen are amazing, because if a layperson was to sit there and look at my work, the questions they would have would be very different to what a critic or a critic would be asking. So I guess if I'd put a Jackson Pollock painting up in front of you, I wouldn't know how to I have some knowledge, but let's say a completely layperson to any art would probably see that and be like, this is a mess.
Yes.
But how would you look at that painting?
Well, I suppose the difference is and this is the tricky bit, because art is so subjective. As much as my job is to advise people what to see and provide my commentary on what I think are good or poor exhibitions, it's still very personal. You can look at a Jackson Pollock and think it's crap. That's acceptable. That's your view.
But we're allowed to think that.
Yeah, you're allowed to think that. You're allowed to think that of anything.
Even if he sells it for 50 million.
Yeah. People can look at Lamborghinis and think they're rubbish cars, right?
True.
They still sell for loads.
That's very true.
Yeah. Because ultimately, when it comes to something selling for 50 million, all that's telling you is that there is one person in the world who has that kind of money who likes it. Doesn't mean that one person's the majority. Yeah. So I'm happy for people to look at something and say, I don't see anything in it, especially abstract art. Abstract art's the hardest, right? Because you're like, what are you looking for? And some people feel something. Some people don't feel something. But then you should read up on the history if you are interested. You don't have to be, right? Read up on the history of why Jackson Pollock did what he did, how he did it, what's the history. And that can change your perspective, right? The more you know about a work. And that's the art. And it's an art form where lots of mistakes happen, but it's the art form of having an information exhibition, right? No one should have to go see a Jackson Pollock without any information telling them, why this work is significant. Same with a Monet, same with any work, why do they matter is something that is often forgotten in art. And I think, it's one of these things where laypersons will ask things that the art establishment will go, well, that's a ridiculous question. And it's like, but that's who you're appealing to, right? If you're in a museum. Same with architecture, I imagine.
Exactly.
Right?
That's the connection, I think. And you're right, because once you walk into an art gallery, I think people will be intimidated to kind of look at a painting that you see the trendy art folk staring at and admiring and talking. And then the layperson is just a bit like, oh, I don't get it. And I think in the same way, like, I might be walking down the street with the missus, and I just stop and I just start staring at a building, and suddenly I'm starting to see, all these kind of, perhaps it's Gestalt influences coming in, or I'm starting to see, I can actually see the date or the age in which this thing was built from something I identified, and suddenly I have this exhilarating feeling of kind of walking through time. And I think that same discrepancy is there, that someone who doesn't know that. So in some ways, I guess what you're trying to say is you see your job as an art critic as not just somebody who kind of provides that kind of review for the artist, but also you're trying to make it more accessible for people.
Yeah, because let's face it, when you've got other writers who've got an art history background and who may have studied this period of art, like if we're talking Pollock, someone who studied abstract expressionism, has written books on it, right? I cannot provide the kind of context that person can, right? They're always going to be more knowledgeable on that. My job being this kind of a sort of, layperson, people's art critic, is to kind of go, this is why I think it's great, or not great, as it may be, and this is why I think you should go see it. That's my job.
So why was Jackson Pollock's painting so expensive?
So that's the question about art. People assume that the headline of the price, so like Hockney recently sold for tens of millions, Picasso's have sold for hundreds, a Leonardo da Vinci sold for 350 million, right? They're mad numbers.
Who's buying this?
Yeah, well, the Leonardo was it the royal family of Abu Dhabi, or I think it was Dubai, maybe it's Louvre Dubai would go into, So, but all that says to you is that, because it's an individual item, it's almost like the height of luxury, right? Because if you buy like a supercar, well, there's more than one of that supercar. If you buy the world's biggest private yacht, someone can build a bigger one, right? But how often does a Leonardo painting come up for sale? Like he's not alive, he's not making them anymore. So you're not going to get a new one. So that's that sort of tangible value of wanting. And I think it's kind of that really sad, if you want something to be in a marketplace where people pay for it, you're always going to get the people who have way too much money than sense, right, to buy these sorts of things because they're interested in owning something that no one else can own.
Yeah. In some ways, that kind of makes you think that the artist would have to die so that they can no longer produce them in order for it to be of value.
This supply and demand, right, really basic economic model.
Yeah. But I mean, because it's quite famously, is it Van Gogh who, after he died only came to fame?
Yes. Yeah.
But during his time, no one really cared.
Yeah, I think he sold one painting or something. But then even then, it's not just his raw talent that made him become a famous painter. It was the fact that his brother was really good at selling his works when he died. Right. So you've got it is very much links between people. Right? I'm sure there are many painters who were fantastic, but just they were never noticed in their lifetime, and all their paintings have been destroyed and we've forgotten about them. Yeah.
In some ways, it's, the last podcast we're talking to Ryan Willard from Business of Architecture. And that was an amazing episode because we were kind of talking about the value of selling, or the value of kind of ascribing value to your work and how you can make your work have more value. In some ways, it's very much kind of linked to this because, like you said, someone could have thrown away what could have been worth millions if they had, if they were to market it with the right value.
Yes.
Yeah. And from what it sounds like, history is the best thing to age, is the best thing to almost, ascribe value.
Yeah. But then also you look at things like, if we're talking history back to 15th, 16th century, we're talking about Leonardo's age or the Renaissance, right? There's very few women artists at the time whose work is valued. Now, is that because there weren't many women painting? That might have been because of barriers, or it might just be there were women painting. It was just the fact that the people who write the history and say who the great artists are were also men, right? So they wrote about it, or it might have been a painter may have been operating in sort of somewhere in Africa where we didn't find out about them because that just didn't travel to us and we didn't know about it. And the art market is it's changing now, but until recently was very Western Hemisphere centric.
Yeah. That's very true, actually. One of the things that keeps coming to my mind is, if we tend to value what has come before us.
Yes.
One example which I think is quite relevant is actually the Stahl movement.
Right.
Which I don't know if you know, the sort of the Dutch movement, the kind of Mondrian started the whole almost deconstructivist, minimal style using the primary colors. Because I recently went to Rotterdam, and in Rotterdam we obviously came across so much of the Stahl movement work, and there were the artists and the architects who were all kind of part of that. One thing that kind of stood out is the fact that they did not take any precedent from history. They were coming up with a new radical idea, and their ideas were completely new because post World War I, post World War II, they had to come up with something quite post World War I. Sorry, they had to come up with something afresh.
Yes.
If we're talking about today's artwork, they don't have the luxury of maybe some of the artists whose work you're a fan of.
Right.
What gives their work value? Because obviously they're not dead and not 300 years old. What would make today, a piece of art today the most valuable? Is it a story?
Yeah.
Is it?
I think there's a lot of factors in there, right? So I think one is you've got to create work that resonates with people. Like there might be a story behind it, might be an idea, a concept, an emotion that people buy into. But ultimately, it will be things like, it's almost like always are the right people noticing it, right? Because that's what matters. Just even today, the art world is still very narrow in its influences, right? So if you're the kind of artist who happens to get your work in front of curators from like Tate Modern, and they end up thinking, this person needs to go in exhibitions, that makes your value shoot up because you've been in Tate Modern. Yeah. And then there's a whole market that evolves around that. So there'll be galleries, commercial galleries in the UK with their artists, like kind of maybe, telling curators who they've got a relationship with about, maybe you need to show our artists because I think, and them knowing that if their artist shows in Tate Modern, the value will go up. So they'll kind of help fund the exhibition to some degree to kind of, because they know the benefits pay off. So there's a lot of little things going on. I think to say that art is a meritocracy would be a lie. It's not a pure meritocracy. Obviously, you've got to have something people can buy into, but it would never go to the you can't just be a great artist in a studio alone and you'll be discovered and everyone think you're brilliant. That will never happen.
Yeah, I get that. And you're talking about there's so many factors at play, and the more I thought about it, the sort of more confused I got as to what those variables are, because this completely ties into architecture and design as a whole as well. Because at the end of the day, there has to be value to what you do, because you won't do it unless you can earn a living off of it.
Yeah, of course.
So money is an important thing to talk about, and value. So some of the things that I kind of reduced it down to three things that I could think of that were sort of, let's say, factors to give your work value. Tell me if you agree with them, or if you think there are any more. I mean, the first being an emotional response. So, if suddenly someone sees a work and instantly they're put into it, euphoria and joy or almost amazement. I think a lot of the time you get curiosity is a big one, right?
Yeah.
In art, people just, what the hell am I even looking at?
Yeah, of course.
And that can often be a very successful thing to do for an artist or designer. And then the other thing I put down was beauty. And I think beauty is a tough one because it could link back to the emotional response.
Sure.
But beauty itself, I think I put it on its own because it's such a subjective thing and everybody sees it differently, but everybody wants to use the word if they like something.
Yes.
So it's almost separate to just kind of being curious. It's like, I just love that, but they can't explain why.
Yeah.
And then the final thing I put down was a statement. So that it's making a statement of something. So it's almost politically or socially or socio-politically charged.
Right.
And so someone would look at a piece of work or art or anything and say, that's important.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you think?
I was trying to think of that one because, I don't know actually. I think that the maker, as it were, whether it be the artist or the architect, has a big influence on that. So if you're someone who's very established doing something a bit radical and a bit new, people are likely to like pluck up their ears and go, maybe like, well, this guy's done really good stuff in the past, so let's give him a bit of benefit of the doubt. And well, if you're an outsider, and I think that comes down to your emotional response, right? If you've got an artist who maybe 100 people have a fantastic emotional response to, but there are 100 people who are not, they're just general members of the public, while there's another artist who one person has a great response to, but they're like a mega gallerist, like Larry Gagosian or whatever, then it makes a difference, right? And getting in front of the right people is an important element of your work, right? Yeah. How do the right people notice your work? Like, they're not just going to stumble across you, right? You've got to be in the right circles. You've got to know the right people. So, and that's quite the sad thing about, people respond to people. And then the artworks come afterwards, right?
It's like that thing, if people are laughing in a room, you're more likely to laugh.
Exactly.
I think it's what we do as humans, and it doesn't, it's not something isolated. It happens in many things.
Though the art world has had hilarious moments of groupthink, as in, I don't know if you remember that person who left their glasses on the floor in a museum.
Oh, yeah.
And people were all gathering around thinking, is this an art? I mean, they'd done it on purpose because they'd placed it against the wall like this, which is not naturally how glasses would fall. Yeah, so that makes sense. But there was also one, there was like, I think it was Art Basel, either Art Basel in Switzerland or Art Basel Miami Beach, where I think two women got into an argument that devolved into a fight and no one intervened because they wondered whether it was a performance. They just kind of stood back and thought, we're in an art fair. Maybe this isn't like, maybe this is, we should stay out of this because it could be real, right? It's a bit like if two people got into a fight and there was a camera nearby, you'd be like, oh, it's probably a film. I'm just going to leave it alone.
The thing is that I think that's what puts some people off. The fact that, they think that art is just something, it's so subjective and you're kind of forcing yourself to have this kind of airy-fairy moment where you're like, oh my God, just look at how beautiful that wall or that shape is.
Yes.
And I think just some people who they don't kind of lean towards that way of thinking or
I think so, that kind of expansive thinking about, like people kicked off about Tracy Emin's Unmade Bed or Maurizio Catalan's Banana that was taken off the wall and eaten by an artist. And they're like, well, where's the value in this? And I suppose there is that sense of emperor's new clothes, right? Where it's like, well, they're just making it up as they go along. But it is that sense that it's so powerful because it is so open as art world, right? The whole world of art changed with, Marcel Duchamp, putting a urinal in a gallery, and when someone challenged him and said, that's not a work of art, he said, well, I'm an artist. This is a gallery. Therefore, it must be a work of art, right? So it's weird because that's the flaw of it and the beauty of art in that, it can be anything, right? I couldn't like walk into a Hollywood studio boardroom and present a painting and say, this is my film. Because they'd be like, well, that's not a film. We know what a film is. A film is done on a certain medium and it's a certain length and it must involve X factors. Art doesn't have that definition. If you try to define art, you struggle.
See, the difficulty is you wouldn't say, you wouldn't say art is a movie, but you would say movie is an art.
Yeah.
So it's like, I think this is what this is why I thought this episode is so crucial, because architecture faces that same thing where, you might, for example, Edward Crooks's walkway through Walthamstow, some of us would look at that and be like, that's not architecture, that's installation. Or that's not installation, that's street art. But some of us are like, no, that is architecture. And, I fall into that category of people who say any type of spatial manipulation or spatial art or spatial logic is architecture.
Right. Yes.
So there's that same kind of problem. It's such a broad field that because of that, there's almost a, and I think maybe that has something to do with why there's such difficult professions as well.
Yeah.
Because arguably art is one of the hardest professions to kind of break into, right?
Yes, I think it is. Yeah, I think it's one of the easiest professions to be part of because you just need like a pencil, right? Or just yourself if it's a performance, right? You don't actually need anything to get started in art. But at the same time, to get to that recognition where you're in that kind of 1% who are making a living from it, it's very hard. Yeah.
And, I think architecture is difficult, and not that it's hard to kind of get into it because you just kind of start studying the course. But it's a profession where I think a lot of us can see that it's struggling because it's what, in terms of the level of hours and money that you need to become an architect, matched up with how much you're paid. It's arguably one of the most difficult professions as well in the world. But it again has this kind of, breakout possibility of you starting a firm and it taking off and you becoming the star architect.
Yes.
Where there is extremely profitable, prospects there. So, there's loads of links. I
think most art professions, that would include music, architecture, art, film, they're all suffering from the same thing, aren't they? Where there's like, you either explode and get right to the top, and there's a few people at the top who are making mega bucks, and it's all supported by a bunch of people at the bottom who aren't making very much. I think most talent-based industry, football's the same, right? Like we all see the footballers who make crazy millions, but there's like loads of people at lower league level who don't make a huge amount. But but we all see the footballers who make mega bucks. Same with artists. We see the art that sells for 100 million. We're like, there's so much money in art. But you talk to your average artist and they'll tell you there's not much money at all.
That's really interesting. You kind of changed my perception. And I'm kind of tunnel vision with how architecture's so shit. But architecture's not shit. I'm just saying, I love the profession, but it's difficult at the moment. But kind of actually part of what this podcast and Two Worlds Design, which is the brand behind everything, is to in many ways do what you're doing, which is to really make it accessible and understandable to the lay people what the value of architecture and design is, because it's so diverse.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing now, and what I think will really be the cause for success in architecture in the future, especially in this country, is the possibility to diversify in what an architect can do.
Yeah.
And kind of going back to that example of what architecture is.
Yes.
How would you describe, for example, Edward Crooks's, walkway?
Yeah, so I suppose I would probably consider it an art installation, possibly consider it street art. I would never actually thought it was architecture until you just said it. So that's interesting to hear that. Yeah, because for me, I always thought of architecture, and this is me being more of an architecture novice, is that it needs something to be constructed. You can't just paint on what already exists, which is what Edward's done. But then that might be in a bit of a narrow interpretation,
Yeah, I think a lot of people will have the same kind of what you just described, the same view that, you do need something, built, extruded.
Yeah.
But a lot of the sensibilities that you would need to do that work would be the same ones you'd need to build the building as well. You're working at the same scale of 1-to-1, and that's architecture in a nutshell. You need to make it a habitable space in some ways. But I think the mere fact that it was creating a spatial experience is what makes it an architecture for me.
Right. Okay.
And so I think it becomes quite interesting to see that there are different views on this as well.
And I would never claim to have the monopoly on what's right. Okay, everyone's got their own view.
But the thing is, in some ways, you do because I'm sure there are a lot of artists, who would be like, I need a review by the Londonist or or Tabish Khan to really, as you said, if the Tate accepts your work, suddenly your value shoots up.
Yeah.
So in some ways, you do now hold the key to an almost objective.
Yeah, and obviously there is a sense of responsibility there in the sense of, one of the best things about my job isn't just the fact that my stars end up on a tube poster reviewing big exhibitions, but it's also the fact that, a lot of the time, especially, so I also write for another website called FAD Magazine where I do a weekly top 5. And in that top 5, I can, I'm Mark, who's the editor, gives me relative freedom to kind of put whatever I want in the top 5, right? And that top 5 includes artists exhibitions that weren't written about anywhere else. And that's important for me, that I can share people, and through Instagram I can do as well. I can share art that doesn't get coverage anywhere else. And I think that is important, right? Because they're the ones who are struggling so hard to get noticed. And all the newspapers and the magazines want to write about is the next exhibition at Tate Modern. Yeah. And they're like, well, Tate Modern doesn't need, they're probably thinking that sitting there going, Tate Modern doesn't need the press. I do. Right? Yeah, exactly. They've got a massive marketing budget. I don't have anything. Someone come and write about me, right? So I love the fact that I do have that opportunity as well to kind of help artists. And I think artists appreciate that, they realize that, that it's great for them that I write about them. But at the same time, you were talking about how I've got the authority, but I've always said to artists, once you put your art out there, you're going to get feedback. Yeah. Not all of it's going to be good. Right.
So do you do negative reviews?
So I've had a few conversations with people about negative reviews. So my view is, well, I'm trying to get people to see art, right? So if I write about some small student exhibition and say it's terrible, right? So I've told you about a show you never heard of, only to tell you don't go. What value have I added, right? So generally, most of my reviews will be positive for that reason. But then once we get to the top end, once we're talking like Tate and Royal Academy and places like that and V&A, right? They've got the marketing budget that you will have heard of them, right? There's no question that you won't notice they've got an exhibition. So for me, I think they're game for if I genuinely think the exhibition's poor, I will say so. And I have done, but I've only ever done it at the institutional level.
That sounds very ethical. Yeah, because you don't want to just be, excuse my French, but you're shitting on people's work who are coming up.
Yeah.
And I think you make a fair point that obviously it's because, at the end of the day, it's almost like a responsibility of you that the people who have got the platform, it's almost, in Parliament, the people who are in the chairs, in the places of authority and power, the ones who are governing the show, if you like, they are put to the question. They're held responsible for their actions and their decisions.
Yeah.
In some ways, if you do make it to the top and you are benefiting from being there, you should also be subject to some scrutiny as well.
Yeah, of course. And the same applies for me, right? I get, not often, the art world is a lovely, pleasant place most of the time, but I get trolled and people tell me that my writing's rubbish or people don't agree with me, and that's acceptable, right? As long as, obviously I would always draw the line at anything abusive, right? That I would not tolerate. But if someone wants to say that they completely disagree with me and everything I've said about it is wrong, then they're able to, And if they do it in a nice enough way, I probably will engage with them on social media, have a bit of back and forth. Yeah. But it has happened, and it's just part and parcel. I can't tell artists that you have to accept negative criticism and then be so fragile that I can't accept it myself.
So who critiques the critic?
I've had it from other critics. I've had it from friends or fans of artists who disagree with me because obviously I've said that their favorite artist is not very good. So
yeah, any funny encounters or stories?
No, I don't know. Weirdly enough, one thing I did was I don't make any art, I should add, right, at all. But I am a trustee of an arts not-for-profit, which is called Art Can, who basically is just a collective of artists who band together to get exhibitions, promote themselves, so kind of strengthen numbers, which is great. So they have a postcard fundraiser where every postcard is sold for £40 to help raise money. So that was my first and only ever artwork was made for that postcard fundraiser. And I thought to myself, like, what can I do? I don't know how to draw. I don't know how to paint. So I ended up just taking a postcard and writing all of the negative things that have been written about me over and over again to create this like big abstract work. So you can find it all on there. So what have people said about me? I think it's just like, he hasn't thought it through, ill thought through, poorly written, cheap clickbait. I think all these things have been written about. I don't mind it. I've shown it to friends who look at me and go, how are you not devastated by this criticism? I'm like, it's just part and parcel, right? You accept it.
You're in the business of views.
Yeah, exactly. People are going to disagree with me. Luckily, I write about art and not about politics, because my fellow journalists who write about politics, the stuff they get thrown at them is much, much worse.
It's quite similar though, right? So
people are very, very staunchly.
There's a lot more invested in politics.
And there's a lot more anger in the politics. I mean, Twitter is generally an angry place and not so much in the art world. So, art and Instagram is generally quite a nice place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing I wanted to talk about is kind of bringing this to... Well, actually, first, I want to talk about Banksy.
Oh, yeah.
Because Banksy is a bit of a... Obviously, no one really knows the true identity of Banksy, right?
Yeah, lots of people have theories.
Yeah.
Some people think it's more than one person.
What are the theories? Some people think he's...
This guy from, was it Massive Attack? They think it's the guy from Massive Attack. Some people think it's this Bristolian street artist. Yeah, there's a few ideas around it. Because obviously he gets everywhere. Like, no one's not going to notice, right?
Yeah, and surely a lot of people do know who he actually is, because he has to obviously cash checks and do his bills.
Exactly. So I'm sure people know.
So I was going 75 graffiti cans for the 7th week in a row. I think that's back. That must be him.
Yeah. So I'm sure people do know who he is, but he's another one who basically does what I want to do, but better, as in make art accessible. Right? Wow. He is the most accessible.
Are you Banksy?
No. Yeah. I don't think I could be Banksy. I wouldn't find the time, right? But that's what he does, right? He takes art and he makes it accessible, right? So do you remember that famous stunt that happened recently where like someone bought a work and it got shredded? Yeah. They put that on display at Sotheby's. I didn't actually get a chance to see it, but when it was on display for 2 days only over a weekend, it was raining, and I saw on Twitter someone post the length of the queue at Sotheby's of people waiting to see it. I mean, these are people who'd never go into Sotheby's, because Sotheby's looks quite formal and they'd be all scared of it. And yet they're all queuing to see it. Whenever a new Banksy's put on the wall, they have to put glass up to stop people stealing it. He's so popular because he basically says, I just want to make art accessible, and it's very simple political messages. It's worth noting that within the art establishment, they generally don't like him. Really? Yeah, very much like he's not a typical artist. They've never liked street art much. They've never considered it the same as fine art. But also they think, they like their art to be much more complex and layered, and Banksy's quite straightforward, right? But that's what you want, right? Symbolism. When you're walking past something on the street, you don't want to have to stand there for like 15 minutes thinking about a work, right? It's on the street.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this then, in terms of having a very instinctive or instant response to material, in some ways, to the art, to the actual whatever it is, whether it's a painting, whether it's experienced visually or through your sound or even taste or smell. That's where I think architecture offers a really interesting opportunity, because as a spatial art, as something concerned with the three-dimensional spatial kind of design of things, experience is at its height there. Because when you're looking at a piece of canvas, or you're looking at a painting, or you're looking at graffiti, you're limited by almost a two-dimensional plane. Right. But once it enters into the 3 dimensions, you're then open to sound and smells and walking through it, and touching it and being part of it. Yeah. And so that's why I think architecture offers a really interesting opportunity there. And I wonder, have you ever sort of gone into a building and and felt that you were observing a piece of art?
Do you know what? I've never actually specifically thought that, but I probably have subconsciously, right? You know, and especially when you see like, I mean, there's some obvious ones, but if you think of something like the Barbican with its madcap design, right? That definitely feels like something. I think Barbican's also quite Marmitey, and people love it or hate it. And also, I think we all know that something like that would never be built again, right? That's why I think people like it so much, because they're like, it's such a product of its time.
Or like those paintings where the artist has died and they'll never make another same thing.
It's that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't know. I was trying to think of a building that, you know, you look in.
Well, I mean, even just the Tate Modern, because, you know, Tate Modern was actually recently by, you know, one of our own very critics, one of them, I guess, more well-known critics in architecture, Oliver Wainwright.
Yes.
He writes for The Guardian.
Yes.
He did a recent article putting out his views on the 20 most iconic or influential, or I think, you know, best buildings of the 21st century, I believe.
Right. Okay.
And number one was the Tate Modern.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, was it the Tate Modern or was it the National? No, was it? I'm not
If it's
sure.
21st century, it'd have to be Tate Modern, right?
It would.
Just trying to think, because all the others are older, aren't they?
Of course, yeah. I don't know actually, because National Gallery was. Oh, it must have been Tate Modern, because National Gallery, I'm referring to an extension to. Yeah, the Tate Modern, I think he put for number one.
Yeah.
And Herzog de Meuron are sort of a famous architecture practice.
I have to say, one of the nicest extensions I've seen to, like when I saw the drawings for what it's going to look like, I thought, I don't see much. But when I saw it, I loved how it fits with the older part of Tate Modern. I really liked it. I mean, it's not without its problems. Like if you go to Tate Modern, it's always leaking. There's always buckets collecting rainwater. Like it does have problems. But, you know, I thought that was really nicely done. But then the opposite would be, now I should point out before I say this, right? I do like a lot of Zaha Hadid architecture.
Here we go, yeah.
But have you seen the Serpentine Sackler, which is the second Serpentine Gallery in Hyde Park?
Yes.
So it's a very rectilinear building. It used to be, I think, an old arsenal or for storing artillery shells or something. And then it's got this like big Zaha Hadid flowing extension, which is the restaurant. And it's almost like Zaha Hadid threw up over the side of it, right? It's just like it's like you've taken your style and forced it onto something where it doesn't belong. Yeah. Well, Herzog de Meuron definitely feels like they've taken learning from the existing Tate and kind of integrated into it. I think of architecture exhibitions, one that I really liked was David Adjaye's one at Design Museum.
Right, yeah.
Because when I was seeing all the models and the videos and the pictures of all the things he'd done around the world, I loved the fact that there wasn't a David Adjaye stamp. It wasn't like him saying, I'm going to put my style on everything. It was very much, obviously there's a lot of his own style in there because he designed it, but he was looking at, so this is the history of the place, and this is the cultural aspect, and I'm going to work that into my design.
I love that you said that, because you've just given three really nice references of David Adjaye and Herzog de Meuron and Zaha Hadid, and all fairly different designers. Obviously, Zaha's kind of very different to them, but often in architecture, there's the perception that what stands out is always the standout architects are usually the star architects, and Zaha Hadid is obviously loved and hated because of that. It was this whole new kind of movement of architecture, the parametric, that really took, grasped technology and started to do, in some ways people felt it was very repetitive and felt that there was no real kind of substance to it. And then, but I think a lot of people feel that going through the sensibilities of design, responding to vernacular, responding to the history and culture of the place, they can often feel like that's not going to be as appreciated as, for example, just throwing on a crazy undulating roof that people will go wow and stare at.
What's that thing in America? Hudson Yards? That one that looks mad. Like, there's a lot of hate for it. I've never seen it in person, so I can't comment. But like that that's the kind of thing you're talking about, right?
Exactly.
Really eye-catching and big and bold.
Exactly. But it's kind of nice to know that, someone like you is saying, no, we actually do appreciate the works that are not just stand out.
You say that, but at the same time, with like David Adjaye's thing, would I have had that appreciation if I hadn't got the context from his design museum exhibition, right? Well, things like Zaha Hadid, you don't need to read up. Like, you see it and you're like, bang, I see why people like her work, right?
Right, and that kind of makes me think back to music, because music is that kind of the unblocked sensory. As soon as you hear a nice piece of music, you don't need to allow it in to react to it, straight away enters.
That's true.
And in some ways, Zaha Hadid is like that. Someone's like a visual piece of music that it just goes straight to you, and you know why it's great. So I'm even now, you've got me confused. I'm constantly trying to figure out what is good architecture. And I think a lot of people ask that question as well. But the more I speak to people, the more I realize that it depends, and it's always changing, and it always will.
I mean, and for example, if something doesn't look great or doesn't feel great or doesn't emote, but functionally it's spot on, is that good architecture?
100%, yeah.
If it's something that never leaks, does that make it better than Herzog de Meuron's expected? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, this is the other thing, we recently, as I said, went to the Netherlands, and, we had a group of our friends who went to the Antwerp. Zaha Hadid's got a really famous building in Antwerp. Okay. And, they said when they got there, it was incredible, and they were just, we were going to some of the most important buildings in architecture history, right, where I was really kind of, if you like, just loving every moment of it. And I don't really lean much towards these kind of parametric stuff at the moment, right, but, they were loving that. And then when I kind of got talking to them and I said, so what was it like in the building? And they were like, actually, it was a bit almost eerie. It almost felt like you're in like a spaceship and nothing really doesn't feel like home or comforting. But that kind of exhilaration and curiosity and even uneasiness is still a experience people want. Yeah. So.
And then I suppose that's the thing you think about, right? So, like, for example, you might think that the Zaha Hadid thing is amazing, but it's kind of like, would you want to live there or work there? And same with like an artwork. Like, there are artworks that I've seen, I'm like, that's amazing, but like, would I want it in my home? Maybe not, right? Because it's quite disturbing or something. So there's a lot of that. So I do feel that there are there's some key differences in there. I suppose architecture probably has to wrestle with the functionality bit, which art doesn't necessarily have to do. Yeah. Well, I suppose it does when you buy it, right? So like, if I'm buying an artwork, I need to have the wall space to hang it, right? If I'm a normal person, I'm not talking about museums buying artworks, right? Normal guy is like, I can't buy a work that's like 4 meters by 4 meters because it won't fit anywhere, right? So
well, actually, what if you bought the piece of art to function, and its functional aspect was that it was meant to make you happy and grateful every time you walk past it?
Yeah, maybe.
That could be described as a functional
piece I suppose that's,
And then, but I guess the funny thing about art is that could change. In 20 years' time, you walk past it, you might hate it.
Yeah. That's why I always say to people that if you're buying art, you shouldn't really buy for investment. Just buy stuff you love. And if it goes up in value, great. If it doesn't, you still got something you love.
I saw some of your work, your collection at home. You had it was like a tiger painting.
But the thing with me is funny because I know artists. Yeah. Each artist has like a well, not every artist I own, but most of the artists I own have like a history with me. So like the tiger, the story behind the tiger is so the artist called Abigail Box, who doesn't do tigers, and her work is very different now. She's now in Bermuda, right? So this was a work that she had like left over in her studio, and it was oil painted. Was it oil painted? No, it was painted, but she left it to dry. And then what happened was she thought it dried, but it hadn't. And she applied like wrapped it up in like bubble wrap, which you do with paintings. And only like when it was taken to where it was going and unveiled did she notice that like it had left some damage to the work. So like she's like, it's not really sellable now. And so she knows me really well. So she just texted me. She went like, I can't sell this, right? Because it's been damaged, right? And I don't want to be a person who sells substandard work. That's just wrong, right? Do you want it? And I was like, what, for like free? And she's like, sure, right? And that work is painted on wood, so it's not light, right? It's quite heavy. And Abigail is about 5'2" and very petite, right? And she took it on the tube from like Bromley by Bow in East London to Collier's Wood in Southwest, where I am, all the way on the tube to meet me at the station. And all I did was walk it like the 7 minutes from the station to my house, and my arms were tired, right? And it's just like it's a nice reminder that work has a history with me. And I think there's a work just left of it that might be out of shot in the video that you saw, but essentially as an artist she draws birds, but she draws birds on her diary pages, her actual diary pages. So each diary entry has something about her life in it, which is great in a sense as a work by itself. But I know her and her husband really well. They live in Dulwich, so if I'm in the area, I pop by. So the work that's on that diary page has a diary entry that says, "Tab is coming for tea, buy biscuits."
Oh,
So when I saw that, I was like, well, I better buy that, right?
that's beautiful.
I know. So for me, especially having experience with all these artists, a lot of them have stories that make that artwork more joyful for me than they would for anyone else.
Wow. You know what you just made me think of?
Yeah.
There's a distinction in architecture between what is space and what is place.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this idea that obviously, when you ascribe more variables to a space, it becomes a place.
Yeah.
And usually that's some sort of story, or whether that's an activity.
Mm-hmm.
So, that right now is the corner in the room. But if that was a corner that, I always left my bag and we always left our equipment, then suddenly that's the bag corner.
Right.
And now that's a place.
Okay, I get you. Yeah.
It's not just a space. I guess if you ascribe some sort of function to it, it becomes a place in a way.
Yeah.
But what I find really interesting there is, in some ways, that painting and those paintings, which weren't these kind of, you weren't having Da Vinci paintings that cost millions in your house. You're having something that meant a lot to you.
Yeah.
And in architecture, the home is the best example of that.
Yeah.
Because although our homes and houses are not beautiful pieces of architecture most of the time,
No.
they are the most beautiful spaces and places, because your memories as a childhood, if they're good, hopefully, are in that house.
Yeah.
And what you then have is, for me, that architecture is way more of value than one which is beautifully crafted, and the joinery is amazing, and the polished windows and polished cladding, whatever. For me, this is my childhood home. My memories are embedded in different corners, and I think that's another beautiful kind of connection there as well.
Yes, and it's interesting that the art in my flat, I've got lots of memories and emotional attachment to, but the actual flat itself, probably very little. But like if I was thinking about my childhood home where my mum and dad still are, obviously that's got far more sentimental value to me as a space than, also as a place, than my flat. Yeah, so it's interesting where you think about that. I think I always think of because I don't have a family of my own, that might be why. But if I did, that might change, right? Yeah.
That's amazing, because now I've been living with the missus for 4 or 5 years now, and what would have been an empty room, which actually the flat that we're renting is probably belonged to many people in the past, but now it's my space, it's my memories.
Yeah.
And there's a famous kind of philosopher called Gaston Bachelard, who wrote a book called The Poetics of Space.
Right.
And his theory was that in some ways your memories are physically embedded into the house. And the mere fact of you walking through your front door, and let's say you suddenly trip over a little, nook or floor, it triggers the memory of when you were a kid and you tripped and you fell and you really badly hurt your knee. And so now that spatial, physical quality of that, bump on the floor is a manifestation of your memory.
Yeah.
And if you look at the house as a whole and you were to extrapolate all of those features, suddenly there's a memory bank
Right.
And the home is, obviously the best example of that. I think that could be quite an interesting art piece as well, don't you?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Because at the end of the day, if you do walk into someone famous's house, I think is it the Hunters Museum, or there's a famous museum in London, I think, where he's got an archive of all of his possessions, and he even when his wife died, I think he built a tomb for her or something. Oh. Yeah, I don't know what the name of it is, but people basically go there and experience his house and his room and his collections.
But you've got it with things like, the Charles Dickens Museum, which is where he lived. You've got John Keats' house in North London. You've got Van Gogh house in Stockwell. Because obviously they're just like normal places, but they're embedded with the memories of this is where he lived.
Would you call them pieces of art?
Yeah, I suppose the museum in itself as a whole could be considered a work of art, yeah.
That's the view I'm trying to make you adopt now.
Yeah. But that's the thing, I'm open to anything. If anyone says that's an artwork, then it's an artwork, right?
Yeah. We talked about Zaha Hadid, and there are many other kind of prominent people that come to my mind. You might know some of them. Bjarke Ingels is a really well-known architect, and Fat Architecture. I told you about Sean Griffiths.
Yes.
So he did the postmodern kind of. He was part of a group of people who brought postmodernism into popularity in the UK, and obviously Le Corbusier, and long time ago, one of the most famous architects ever known. They're all architecture firms or designers whose work is really contested.
Right.
And we kind of touched upon this as well. And it kind of makes me think that you can't be extremely well known as an artist, or successful even, without having loads of criticism and contestation over your work.
Yeah, I wonder whether that's also because it's in the public eye. Because I remember having this discussion about, so there was a survey done about what is the worst film ever, right? To the general public, right? But the problem is the actual worst film has not been seen by anyone because it was bad, right? So to be voted a worst film, it has to have had enough exposure that people have seen it, but also a lot of people agree that it's terrible. So in the end, I think in that poll, this was a poll maybe 10 years ago, it was Titanic. That was number one.
For the worst movie?
Yeah, because I think there was enough people, everyone had seen it, and there were enough people who disliked it. But that doesn't make it the worst movie. It's just the fact that it's the worst movie according to those people that's been seen by all those people.
Because it was such a, so many people had watched it. Statistically, had the most dislikes.
Exactly.
Like a Justin Bieber YouTube video.
Exactly, right? Yeah, so it's that sort of thing. Like if you went to the most hated Facebook page, it'd probably be Liverpool's page by the Everton fans, right? It's just that you've got to get to a level where there's enough people recognize you, right? Well, most of the time, if you look at architects, right, if you're too small and too minor, nobody even knows you exist. Like all of those, is it the famous Carbuncle Cup, which is like the ugliest building of the year?
Yes.
None of them are very minor architects, are they? They tend to be quite well-known architects because they got on the radar.
Yeah. And you kind of bring up something quite interesting, and it's you said this in an interview with Al Jazeera, actually. I'm doing it. I always try to dig really deep with people, yeah. But you said in an interview with Al Jazeera that you'd rather hate a piece of work than have no response to it at all.
Yeah.
And I think the interviewer was kind of talking to you about how is everyone just trying to do something standout or statement? Because I think you guys were kind of contesting on the
turn prize.
That's it.
I always feel like the worst reaction, because every time an artist makes a work, they're making a statement in the world, right? I don't contest what the statement's about. It could be about anything, right? But they're saying something. They have something to say, and that's what they're using their art to say. Whether it's an expression of beauty, whether it's an expression of politics, whether it's an expression of their own experience as an individual in the world, right? So when you put that emotional investment into something and put it out there, surely the worst reaction is nobody reacts. Yeah. That's like, if people don't like it, fair enough, right? What I've done is pure to me, and if you don't like it, fair enough, right? But if what I've done is pure to me and your reaction is like, I didn't even notice it was there. Yeah. Like that's worse, surely.
It's almost more insulting that it goes unnoticed. If what you're trying to do is make something a talking point in some ways. Yeah. That's what you mean by making a statement.
Yeah, so I think you have to be careful about that, because I suppose we can't say that artists are doing it on purpose to sensationalize.
But some
are, yeah. But many aren't, right?
Would you say the right way to do it is to not do that?
It depends, actually. It depends what you're trying to do, right? Like if what you're doing is true to yourself and it is also controversial, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? So if you think about that whole like Tracy Emin's bed, the unmade bed, which was like filled with like condoms and all sorts, right? Her view was that this is representative of a time in her life. Yeah. Right? Now, you can't, and that I do believe that to be true, but you can't say to people, well, she just did it because like she wanted to grab attention, because it clearly was representative of a time of her life.
It's always hard to know those things at the end of the day, though, because, you know, I think we live in a culture again where, you know, views mean everything. And, you know, even YouTube, now that I'm getting into this YouTube thing, you know, you end up realizing that clickbait or reeling somebody in is important. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, if you're not able to stand out from an extremely competitive field in the first place, you've got no chance of doing anything in there. Yeah. So it's, in some ways, it's the same thing, right? Like in such a competitive field.
And that's quite sad, right? Because it means the artists who aren't sensational or sensationalizing may not get noticed, even though their work has something to say, but it's a bit more subtle. Or, you know, and that's the downsides of things like Instagram, right? If you've got work that doesn't translate well into a photo, even though it's got really something important to say, then you might get missed because other people make work that's very, to use the phrase, Instagrammable, right? And it's the same with, like you say, with YouTube, right? If we did this interview for 2 hours and it's really good, but there's like one thing that I say that's really controversial, that's what you use as the headline, right?
Do you want to say anything?
No, I'm not going to say it controversial.
It would really help me out.
But that's the thing that makes people click. They're like, he said what? Like, you know.
I'm going to just write that this is the real Banksy.
Yeah, I found the real Banksy, and suddenly people will watch it, right? Because they'll be like, "Oh my god, he's found him." Yeah.
To be honest, it'd be a pretty good cover up if he was just like some art critic.
That would be good,
hiding
right?
in plain sight in some ways.
Yeah, it'd be funny if it was like someone who's written articles about saying other people are Banksy turned out to be Banksy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you just don't know. No. And the great thing is, like, I think whoever he is, or they are, or she is possibly, they revel in the fact that every now and then some rumor comes out, oh, it's this person, right? It's great. It's just like, sure, why not?
But then how would they eventually confirm it? Let's say he does say, or it or she.
Yeah, people go, no, it's not true.
Yeah, it's not you.
Yeah, like you'd have to have proof that you are,
Exactly, you have to show some sort of bills.
And then people would say, oh, you know, it's been deep faked or whatever, you know, it's not real. Yeah, and I think that's the other thing around, like, you know, I think it's that thing that, you know, you sucker people in by saying something that they disagree with, so they'll click on it and go like, that's wrong.
But I like what you said, that it's, you know, if you're true to yourself, that's what matters at the end of the day.
Yeah. You want to feel like you made something that you believe. I mean, look, I don't want to say that people who make art should not be able to make money. Of course they do, right? But when you're in a creative field, whether it be art, architecture, design, fashion, film, I do believe that 99.999% of people in those fields did it not because of money as the number one thing, right? Well, if you go into somewhere like banking, the percentage will be very different, right? So it's great if you make money, and I want everyone who's in that field to go out and make money if they can, but your money's not your number one driver, and it never will be. And that purity is something that, you know, I kind of respect a lot of people in creative fields, that's... Yeah, but the problem is that obviously is then used to justify the low pay often, isn't it? They're like, oh, you're doing what you love, so therefore you don't get paid much.
But you know what? And I might be making a big claim here, but I feel like the only route to success in a really, you know, with real longevity, and to be, you know, not that the aim is to be the legend in the field or whatever, But to get to that level where you're on top of the field, I believe that it is through pursuing your genuine passions. And that is the hardest route, but it's the only route, because I think once you get past a certain point of you've just stuck with your guns, you've just been really pushing what you love, and you've been genuinely learning and refining what you do, that is the only way you will actually break and have real success. Because I think, if you think of a lot of the examples, and I guess it's not a good reference, but Netflix do a lot of series. I think Abstract is one of the best series I've seen.
It's on my list. Haven't seen it. I do need to watch it.
It's incredible.
Okay.
It's a beautifully produced, series, taking you kind of in depth into the life of these creative individuals. Obviously, sometimes it's not just individuals. Usually it is, but they're showing you the whole ethos and the come up and their mind frame and everything. A lot of them talk about how they've always been doing what they believed in.
Yes.
And every single one of them have endless success. And it always stems from something really pure and really genuine.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the advice that, because I'm going to be asking you for your advice later as well. But a lot of the advice, so you can't give me this advice because it's taken, is be true to who you are and find out what you're really passionate about as a designer. And when you can really pursue what you're passionate about, of course you're going to invest loads of time into it. And that's, I think, the key, right?
I completely agree with you. The one thing that I would call out is that that's great, but then my concern with that is always the issue of kind of diversity in fields, right? So, for example, if you say you've just got to pursue what's true to you and go for it, so there'll be say 20 artists who are all doing that, which is great, right? But that means most of them will go 15 years of only £5,000 a year until they finally get recognized for being true to their passion. And then they start making decent money and they can live off it and it's great, right? Who can afford to do 15 years at £5,000 a year? People with rich mums and dads, right? And that's why you get that sort of lack of if I was from a poor, I'm not from a poor working class background, but if I was, right, and I was really into creative stuff, I would know that I'm like a burden on my parents until I move out, right? Yeah. So I'd probably go, actually, if I follow accountancy, then at least I'll be out. I may not be true to myself, but I'll earn decent money. And then I can take that stress off my parents by moving into a better house, maybe even buying them a better house or something. You can do all that stuff. While in the creative fields, you're always running the risk that you will go many, many years before you strike it. It doesn't have to happen. Obviously, you could hit it straight away.
I think I completely agree as well. I think what I was saying as part of also being true to yourself is the ability to refine what you do. And I think, you're 100% right. If you're just like, I'm going to do exactly what I want to do and I don't care what anyone else thinks because I'm true to myself, you can end up being really obtuse and doing something that's no one has any kind of value for that. But then if you're still being true to yourself, but you're also being open to refining your philosophies and methodologies and learning more, that kind of humble nature to your work as well. I think that's what I mean by being really true to yourself as well.
But it's a difficult balance to strike, right? And then sometimes everyone's life is full of compromises, right? So you've just got to occasionally, I don't know, if you're a designer or something, you'll take a commercial gig that you don't really feel anything about, but it's the stuff that pays the bills so that you can do the stuff you love, right? I think but to be fair, it even happens at the top end. I remember, someone always said to me, if you ever see Edward Norton, the film actor, right, in a film that you're like, why is he in that film? It's so not an Edward Norton film. Is that he often does it because then the studio will bankroll the independent project that he wants to do. Right. They make that arrangement. If you star in this film, we'll bankroll that.
I think I remember hearing about that actually, specifically that one.
I think the Italian Job is the one that's held up where you're like, why is he in that? A remake of the Italian Job. You're like, he's really phoning it in. And you're like, well, because they said after that they'll bankroll his other thing. So it's And that's fine. If you're comfortable with that, you do that, right? Same with like artists, you know, they do like side jobs here and there. They live in like guardianship buildings, you know, where they're looking after a building for cheap rent so they can stay somewhere central. You know, you choose you choose your own path. And that's why I would never be so strong as to judge someone for doing that, because everyone's got to do what works for them, right? 100%. Like I've got my day job in the energy sector, right? That pays my mortgage. Something has to, right? The writing doesn't pay very well at all. So
how do you find time for that then? Because are you working?
Yeah, essentially I work 7 days a week. Yeah. So I work most days and I work most evenings. At most evenings I'm doing something, whether out exhibitions. So yeah, or writing reviews. So yeah, you fit it all in, you make it work, right? Yeah. But it's ideally, it's still kind of 2 full-time jobs, which is quite a lot. So I need to be good at balancing that.
Would you hope to just dedicate your whole life to the art side of things?
I think I'd like to. Yeah, whether I can or not, I don't know. But then sometimes I always wonder whether I need to be brave enough to take the leap, you know? Because a lot of artists I know have done that. There's a lot, the arts are full of people who had corporate jobs. Yeah. And they were like, you know what, I'm dying inside. I'm just going to, I mean, thankfully my corporate job isn't that bad, right? But for some of them, it was like, this is horrendous. I don't want to do it. What I really want to do is art. And they've just like quit cold turkey and they made it work. And in some cases they haven't and they've had to go back to it. Or they do a bit of consultancy here and there to pay the bills. But yeah, it's whatever works for everyone.
You talked about this idea that, and again, kind of your Al Jazeera words, where you said you would rather hate a piece of work than have no response to it at all. I loved that. But it makes me think, what is your most loved art or piece of art that you kind of really is kind of, you know, something really you're attached to or love and comes to mind quickly? And what is also a piece of art or, you know, anything that you hate the most? And then finally, which of the two is better?
Well, I think that's the thing with art, it's 100% subjective, right? So better can never be, it's better in my view, the one that I love, but it may not be better in someone else's view. So, I mean, one of the exhibitions I really loved, it was in Barbican, I can't remember how many years ago. It's an Icelandic artist called Ragnar Kjartansson. And he does all these, like a lot of his work's video, and that might tap into the music element where you said like music hits you harder. So he's got film, music, and he's got 2 works that really stood out for me. So one is quite bizarre and harder to grasp, and the second one's a bit easier. But the first one, I'll do the harder one first. It's like a 60-minute video, and it's based in this like New York mansion, and it's on, I believe, 7 screens. So you're in a space with 7 screens at different angles. So you have to walk around the space throughout the whole 60 minutes. And it's him and his friends playing this song, this kind of lilting melody that ebbs and flows. It's beautiful in this New York mansion. And like one's on the drums, one's on the guitar, one's cello, one's vocals, but are in separate parts of the building. But as you move around the installation, whichever one you're closer to is louder because the speaker's attached to the screen. So when you're near the cellist, she's the loudest. You can hear the others in the background. And it kind of ebbs and flows. And it's just absolutely beautiful. And that you're just mesmerized by it. Like, it takes a lot to keep me in place for 60 minutes, like walking around on my feet, right? So that was beautiful. And the other work that he did was, it's called A Lot of Sorrow. So there's a really catchy 3-minute song by a band called The National called Sorrow. It's really catchy, kind of, I don't know how to describe it, kind of like pop rock song, right? And they're playing it on stage. And he basically asked them to play it over and over again for as long as they could without break. So it's them playing the same 3-minute song over and over again for 6 hours. With him like appearing on stage randomly in the videos, like giving water and food and so on to keep them going. And obviously, occasionally, like the drummer will take a bathroom break. So there'll be one version of the track where there's no drums, and they'll kind of switch. And eventually, the performance was meant to go as long as it could, and it stopped after 6 hours when the vocalist's voice just gave out and he just couldn't do it anymore. But I love this sense of like when you watch it, you're almost like enduring it with them. it's almost like I'm in solidarity with you and I want to hang out for as long. I've never managed a full 6 hours. I've done like 1 hour. And that's one work. I think the video works. Weirdly enough, on average, video art is possibly my most disliked medium. Like I've disliked more video than I have any other form of art. But it's also some of my favorite works.
Wow. Because when it works,
it's got such an emotional attachment to it. And I think the reason it doesn't work is also linked to, so when you see a painting, your interaction with a painting is defined by centuries of paintings, right? So everyone knows paintings and knows how to interact with them, right? You go and you look at it and you can spend hours or minutes or seconds. But with video, everyone's first interaction with video is almost always cinema and TV and film, right? So you interact with a video, whether you like it or not, in the way you would interact with cinema or TV often. So like when a piece of film or video art, whatever you want to call it both, takes too long to get to the point, if it's a narrative work, obviously not all works are narrative, you're kind of just getting annoyed, like, come on, just get to it, right? Like there's 10 minutes of gold in your 45 minutes, right? I just want the 10 minutes. So I think that's why it's harder. And also galleries aren't always designed for like video, right? I'm not going to watch an hour-long video where there's nowhere to sit down, right? Like, what do you want me to do? Just like sit on the floor? I don't know. Yeah.
Especially when you were describing that artist who's worked with instruments in different rooms.
Yeah.
You know, that makes me really excited. I know, you know, you didn't necessarily come into this conversation thinking that, you know, architecture was more than just, you know, buildings, but it's this kind of spatial experience that I'm describing. For me, I would describe that as an architectural, you know, installation experience. You walk around the house and, you know, there's almost a different sensation when you hear a different instrument.
Yes. So I should add, screens are in the house, but you're within a darkened space. But it's also, you are navigating the space between the screens, right?
So it was done well enough for you to feel...
Yeah, like feel you're walking around it, and and like you said, there's a very strong element of architecture in that, right? Because the other one that's my favorite architecture exhibition of all time was called Sensing Spaces at the Royal Academy of Arts.
Yeah, is that right?
It was just a mixture of architects were in there. So Kengo Kuma was in it.
I've seen that, yeah.
Grafton Architects were in it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. I mean, I'm sure if you went on the website, you see all the names. But it wasn't just the fact that people were doing interesting things with architecture. It was the fact that the Royal Academy galleries are galleries I'm very familiar with, right? Because I've seen many, many exhibitions in there. But it was the fact that the architecture changed your experience of these familiar galleries, right? So, for example, there was one by, von Oerichhausen? Is it Peter von Oerichhausen? I don't know. But the architects, they built this massive wooden contraption that you could climb up, right? You can go up to it. But it took you to the ceiling. Now, the Royal Academy of Arts galleries are massive. They're really tall, right? I don't even know how tall they'd be, maybe like 5 meters tall or whatever, right? So you went to the top, and now you're really close to all the little decorations on the ceiling, you know, Victorian style cornice and all those really fancy decorations they always had on the ceiling. And now you're having a different experience in a gallery that you've been many times, thanks to that architecture.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
To me, that's really inspiring, you know, thinking about how I want to kind of get this message across to people of how diverse architecture is. Because if I said to you that, you know, I'm an architect, I design giant wooden structures that take you to the ceiling and make you observe, you know, medieval cornices, you'd be like, are you sure you're an architect? Yeah. But that's what I think we're trying to, you know, as you say, you're kind of trying to change the perception around art. I also feel like I'd like to change the perception around architecture. And that's a beautiful example of it, yeah.
Yeah, and like of the opposite end of that big wooden structure, there was a darkened room where Kengo Kuma had put incense sticks together. Now, this wasn't something you could climb. It was just it was a structure. But you go in there and it's dark and you can smell the incense. And it's just, it's something else, right? You're feeling, and I think that smell is same, right? I mean, even to the really basic things, there's something weird. There's memories to things like, I don't know, like new car smell. Like when you go to a car, you can smell the new car smell. Okay, this is, or even new building smell. When you walk to a new building, you're like, yeah, it smells like it's new.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what I was trying to say about how architecture will open up all the dimensions. And it will allow, smells to be travel around a room or a space, because we exist in those dimensions. Peter Zumthal is another, example of an amazing architect who tries to use these kind of more, ephemeral dimensions in his work. And, he did a famous piece where it was the smell of pine wood from, I think, Swiss pine everything was made from Swiss pine. So when you walk in, you're just hit with a strong smell of, almost an unearthly smell of pine.
Nice.
From what I've read, it was extremely strong, but extremely comforting as well. And you would see that as art. But or at least you would see Kengo Kuma and those installations as art. Whereas I would walk into that gallery and be like, no, that's architecture. So we're able to kind of have different views on it. But
I think so, yeah. And some people would look at Kengo Kuma and say that's design, right?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, design is this tricky word, because if we're saying architecture and art are all-encompassing, design is probably even more all-encompassing.
Yeah. So I don't know how you would. Yeah, but then I don't think there's any need to separate them, right? Yeah.
True. I definitely agree with that. So it's difficult to kind of ask for advice for an architect. I can't really. But I still think everything you talk about, and hence why I've invited you here in the first place, is really relevant to architecture students, design students. As we've said, design is all-encompassing. What advice would you give to artists, architects, designers, as a critic, for people who are kind of looking to get their work out there? Or so what are the ingredients for success, I guess, in such a difficult field?
I don't know, it's always, because I always get asked this a lot by artists, and it's almost like there is that sort of sense of just being present and noticed makes a difference, right? The fact that you exist is good, that people know you exist, right? And that's the thing when I said about I'd rather people hate work, right? Because if they hate your work, at least they remember who you are, right? So when the next time they come around and go like, well, I hated him before, and then actually, maybe this time I like him, right? Things will change, right? And that's the thing, when you start to get noticed, it snowballs, right? So like, because one of the things that people always say is that when you see somebody who's like come out of nowhere to become successful in whatever field they're doing, right? I think everyone knows nobody comes out of nowhere. Like when someone comes out of nowhere, they've been doing a lot of hard work, they've just not been getting noticed. And then suddenly everything starts to connect and they start getting noticed. Like I've had people say that to me, like as a writer, they're like, I'd never heard of you, and then suddenly you're out of nowhere. I'm like, well, I've been writing for 5 years, right? So it's that sort of thing that the more people know about you, the more they know your work, the more you share it. It may not immediately deliver results, right? You might think, oh, I've sent this email to people about my work to 100 people and not a single one of them responded, right? Out of the 100 people, I'm sure there are ones who opened the email. They just didn't respond, right? It doesn't mean they didn't notice it, right? And that's sort of, and then also building a community about yourself, right? Because a lot of like, when you look at artists who become famous, so the famous group was the young British artists, which is Damien Hirst, Tracy Emin, all of them, right? So they were a collective of artists who became, who kind of rode this wave of fame. Now, there are people in that group who are less famous. There's a question, right? Do you reckon they would have been successful if they weren't associated with the ones who were famous, right? It's that sort of thing. And also, if you're in a community where people are doing well, let's say one of you becomes really successful, then somebody will obviously ask them, like, any other architects you recommend? Like, who's good? Who do you think? And they're like, oh, this guy, went to university with him, or I hang out with him.
Now you can do that for me.
Yeah, exactly. You can do that for me as well, right? It's that sort of thing that everyone kind of, the more advocates you have in all places, And I suppose the more we have this discussion, the more I think you shouldn't tie yourself down to one field, right?
Yes.
Yeah. The more that, why should architecture be just about making buildings? Why can't it be about something else? Someone like the Royal Academy does have an architecture curator, right? So that sort of stuff does get people out there, right? And I just wonder whether that kind of level of exposure is all no such thing as bad publicity, right? Yeah, the more you're noticed, the better it is. And then if you really want to get into kind of, once you've got a product or something that you want to share with the world, then it's almost like looking at what are the angles and what are people interested in? How can my work be made? Obviously, your work is pure to yourself, but there are ways of fitting things in, right? So for example, if you're doing something and it just so happens that other people are doing something similar, you can kind of work your way into that and say, oh, my work's similar to those people.
Right, okay.
Yeah, because people are often looking for an angle for a story, right? So I think about, and I'm going to be very art-centric because it's the world I know, right? But you're a small group of artists who, make photography, right? If you happen to be showing your exhibition at the same time that Photo London is in town, which is the big photography fair in London, it's like, at that time, most newspapers are looking for roundups of what are the best photography exhibitions to see during Photo London, right?
Yeah.
Timing works out, right? Even though you're not affiliated with them at all, right? That sort of stuff works out. Are people looking at stories that relate to, big world events, right? Just so happens you make political art. Well, is there any way to tie it into what's happening in our politics? Well, our politics is always changing, so it probably is going to be some way to tie it in, right? That sort of stuff. So it's just looking at kind of left field ideas. Yeah.
I didn't expect to get so many good pieces of advice.
Right. Okay.
You got to write a book about that, a short little book, because you write as well, don't you?
I do write, yeah. Of course, yeah.
That'd be a very buyable book.
I think so. Do you know what I find about writing is that I've tried a bit of long form writing. Yeah. And I don't really like long form.
But you can make it very colloquial, now these self-help books.
Maybe it should be like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And then, but then also, this thing about, I think a lot of people are afraid because if you think about like me and my day job, right, energy, I write like a report, right? That report is based on what my company wants to think and what several of my colleagues think, right? If that report gets out there and people don't like it, I don't really care, right? It's not my personal baby. It's not like me, blood, sweat, and tears. But when an artist or an architect creates something, it is. So when I think people get really scared that people are not going to like it, they're scared of putting themselves out there because, it's like being rejected, right? Public rejection. So when a critic says something about your work, right, that's like it's publicly being slated. It's not just being like slated to your face behind closed doors, right? It's very, and I think that's one of the things I always said about being criticized is that if you ever get criticism, the best way to deal with it is always to is grace, right? Say thank you, right? If someone said like your work is crap, they just like slated it completely, 1-star review, whatever. If you reached out to that critic and said, I appreciate you taking the time to come see my show. I recognize it wasn't for you. Maybe my work in the future will be, That shows that you've got a level of maturity as well, that you're willing to say, and to quote a great 21st century philosopher, haters gonna hate, just got to shake it off. T Swift, yeah. I get a lot of my advice from her.
T Swift. I was waiting for some proper, some Derrida or something.
No, we'll go Taylor, right?
For everyone who didn't know, that's a Taylor Swift, the acclaimed singer, songwriter, and physicist.
Philosopher?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Mate, that was really beautiful. Thank you so much for that.
It's all right.
This might sound really random, but I really want to quickly talk to you about what your favorite movie or movies are, because I feel like you've talked a lot about film in this podcast.
Yeah.
And I'm a huge movie person. You seen The Joker?
I loved The Joker. That was my favourite film of last year.
It was incredible.
Joaquin Phoenix was brilliant. And I also felt like, look, don't get me wrong, I'm never going to take anything away from Heath Ledger in Dark Knight, who was brilliant. But Heath Ledger definitely felt like the Joker for a comic book film. Well, Joaquin Phoenix is like the Joker that you could see coming into being in today's world, right? You could see that kind of guy, especially in today's world where, like, you know, where we're drawing money from like healthcare, and yeah, you could see him falling through the cracks, and then that could be, that could easily happen. In terms of other films, I just like films that with interesting ideas. Like, I mean, Matrix, it's an obvious one. Love The Matrix. Loved Inception. You know, that was a brilliant film as well.
What bits about the Joker did you like the best?
I love the fact that it's just very much, I think, so a lot of criticism that came back for the Joker was that people thought, oh, you're making this kind of essentially like an incel person into some sort of sympathetic character. And the thing was that he wasn't sympathetic. Like, I didn't think, oh, that could be me, right? When given a certain situations, I never thought that, but it was just you felt pity for him, right? You felt, I think that was Mark Kermode who said, he's not sympathetic, he's pitiable, right? He was pitiable. So he took pity on the fact that his life has fallen apart, right? And let's face it, you know, I imagine for a lot of people who commit crimes, it is because their life's fallen apart. It's not because they're naturally horrible people, right? Very few people are naturally horrible, right? So I love the fact that it just showed it in such a way that you thought, I could see that happening. Yeah, and obviously Joaquin Phoenix is brilliant as an actor, right? So good in that role.
Would you say he's an artist?
Yeah, so he's an artist, right?
Really? So you'd say he's an artist and the director's an artist? There's a lot of artists.
But then you get into that thing like, well, so if Joaquin Phoenix is an artist, right, is Freddie Prinze Jr. or Megan Fox artists? So you see, that's the thing, like, I don't think you can say that and draw a line. You've either got to accept all actors are artists.
Is that what you expect?
Or no actors are artists.
What do you expect?
I think they all are, right? You can say some are more acclaimed or better in certain criteria artists, but everyone is, right?
Why? Because they're sort of they're actively trying to portray some sort of narrative through.
Yeah, they've got their craft, right, and they've dedicated themselves to it. You know, as the famous quote from, I think it's Picasso, isn't it? Which is that every child is born an artist. The difficulty is keeping them that way, right? Because we all are creative individuals, how we express our creativity. And even people in office jobs express creativity, right?
Yeah.
It may just be in, like, I don't know, how they run their meetings or how they write documents. That's creativity, right? It's a different type of creativity. And you could argue that contemporary art is the most unbridled because it's completely free from any requirements.
Yeah. I think it kind of comes back to what we were talking about, having the confidence to just put your work out there. Yeah. And a child has that kind of unbounded confidence of like, this is me and this is what I want to show you. And
well, you remember the Emperor's New Clothes? It was eventually a child who broke the spell, wasn't it? When he said the Emperor's naked, and everyone's like, oh, yes, he is. Okay. Right.
So harnessing that inner child is probably...
Yeah. And they're really honest. Like, getting their expression on art is hilarious, right?
Exactly. I think there's like a YouTube, there's a YouTube video of that went viral.
Right, okay.
Where, I don't know, they just get kids to review loads of random things. Art might be one of them. But you know, with the Joker, the thing that really struck me was there was a moment in the movie, and I don't remember what moment it was. I think there was one moment, and spoiler alert for those who haven't seen it.
Oh yeah, of course.
Pause it now or skip a little bit. There was a moment where he went into his hysteria. Yeah. His laughing fit. And it was, I think, at the point, one of the bits where he did it in its most extreme way, and Haquin is really good at kind of doing the Joker laugh. And it was it's actually a very funny chuckle. It's a really funny way of laughing, and he did it in a really extreme way. And I remember half of the people in the cinema were grinning or kind of laughing because even though he was in pain, and he was suffering because he laughs and has a laughing fit when he's
Yeah.
not feeling happy.
Yeah.
The sheer sound of it was enough to just be so absurd and so kind of contradictory to people's mind. They couldn't help but express this kind of grin, like an awkward grin in a way.
Yeah.
I was one of them.
Okay.
But the missus next to me, she was the other half, who were kind of horrified by, you know, the kind of sinister, you know, feel of that moment. And so I just love the fact that we've been talking about how good art contests people and it splits people. This movie has not just split people, but that scene really split everyone. And I think some people, and this is why I think we'll put the movie down in the history books as one of the best movies ever made, in my opinion.
Okay.
Because it ticks so many boxes for me. And, you know, another one of them would be just how they made you empathize with what you think is evil, and you realize at the root of it, it's something else.
I mean, in truth, there's very little evil in the world, right? Yeah. It's like that thing where, you know, when you ask people, if you could travel back in time and kill the baby Hitler, would you? And most people go, sure, because obviously of all the horrendous things he did. But then when you go, but what if there was an option of either killing him or talking to his parents, telling his parents what he's going to become to stop that happening? Most people go, oh yeah, well actually, given that circumstance, I'd probably talk to the parents, right? And it's just that thing that you naturally go to, oh, it must be, you know, there's something wrong with them. And then you realize, oh, actually, yeah, there's no such thing as natural evil apart from people who've got significant mental health issues from the birth, for example. You know, it doesn't exist in the world, right? And to call it that kind of takes away a certain agency and you kind of dehumanize, right? It's like when people look at things like serial killers, terrorists, whatever, murderers, they go, oh, well, they're nothing like me. And it's like, well, actually they're humans, right? Yes. They are the exact same species. Their just life went on a very different path to ours. But to say that is scary because it's to accept that they are like us, and you don't want to do that. You want to think they're very other. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, we ended on a slight tangent, but a fun one anyway.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you so much for the episode.